Okay. Well, we are live. We are live. Well, welcome everyone. I am so excited to kick us off today. And so, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really not sure where everyone is joining us from. So, drop in the comment below on LinkedIn itself. Where are you tuning in from today? And so, it's always nice to see folks from so many different parts of the world joining in for these conversations. And while you're doing this, I just wanted to welcome you all to today's special episode of Product Power Play, which is a special LinkedIn live series that I started in January, where I sit down with some amazing and inspiring product leaders to have some real candid conversations about leadership. And today we have a really special guest. Hi, Saana.
Hi, Bosky. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Overall, doing well. And as we were just talking a little bit before the show, there's good, bad, and ugly in everything. So I'm here to share as many insights as I have and be as real as possible.
Love it. Love it. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I'm going to be introducing Sana in just a little bit. So just, a little bit of patience. What I wanted to share is that today we're not going to be skimming, the surface level details and service level stuff about what it means to be a leader, especially in product and tech and all of those things. We're going to be diving deep into unspoken challenges, lessons, and maybe even some of those tough unlearnings that shape leadership journeys. And we're going to hear this directly from Sana. And with that, just wanted to introduce myself for those of you who may not know me. Hey, everyone, I am Baski Mukherjee, and I'm the founder of PMDojo, where we offer personalized one on one programs, especially to women, so that they can rise up in tech and product executive leadership roles. And we do this by covering the right skills, both hard skills as well as human skills and EQ skills, as well as the mindsets. And we also work with product teams all the way from ICs as well as people leaders to really help them develop those skills and master those skills that's going to help them solve those messy problems when it comes to building products and growing teams and all those messy middle that happens working together and things like that. So, this is an episode that you don't want to miss, especially if you are a woman in tech, in product. Maybe you are looking and thinking about your next leadership role. So this is for you. And tag your friends, tag other women friends that they should be coming and joining us. It's, I think, really special. And I have a feeling that it's going to be vulnerable and it's going to be very, very real talk. So let's get started. Grab your coffee, grab your tea, water, whatever that beverage of choice is, and let's sit down and get started. And if you have questions, please put them in the comments. I can see them here. Sana can see them as well. We will take the audience questions along the way. And I just wanted to share this. I think a lot of times we all go through the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows in our life and career, especially as a woman. And a lot of times I know I have thought that I'm the only one who is going through this and no one else is. And so if you're going through something or if you connect with some of our conversations, let us know in the comments. Who knows, you might just inspire someone else who might be listening or watching. And so with that, let's get started. So Sana, welcome. I'm
Thank
going
you.
to try to see if I can get all the amazing things that you've done correctly. So Sana is currently the Chief Product and Experience Officer at Chief. And for those of you who are not familiar with Chief, Chief is one of the largest networks that support women in executive leadership roles with a vetted community and tons of insights, especially to move up in leadership roles to help them succeed in today's fast-paced moving, business environment. And prior to that, and this is one of my favorite, Sana was also the president and the chief product officer at the Moms Project. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. And it's a digital talent marketplace where it makes it easier for companies to hire moms and working parents. And if this is not enough, Sana also held product leadership roles at Instagram, where she helped the platform and the teams grow immensely. And we're going to talk about that in our conversation and what really that meant. I mean, the numbers are pretty interesting, 1 billion monthly active users. So you definitely want to hear that story. And Sana, you began your career at McKinsey and Company.
I did, yes. So in consulting, yeah.
Yes, and you're also an angel investor.
And
And you live in the Bay
women-led businesses. That's
for
yeah.
women-led businesses.
Yeah.
Very important. And you live in the Bay Area with a wonderful family, a husband and 2 kids.
That's right. And luckily they're at school. So hopefully they won't be joining us, although if anybody else's kids want to come join us, the more the merrier.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is amazing. How do you do all of this?
You're starting off with a tough one.
Yes.
So look, I think, I kind of alluded to this. I think a lot of women and leaders look like they have it all together on the outside. And the reality is that, and this is my strong view, is that nobody really has it figured out, right? So we're all kind of still trying to figure out how to make it work. And the reality is that for me, you mentioned I'm here in the Bay Area. I have 2 young kids. They're 8 and 6. And I've been in product leadership roles for some time now. And my husband is also very much someone who is leaning into his career. And so we are 2 kind of very, and have always been like pretty type A ambitious people. And I will say that it was a little bit of a shock when we first had kids of, okay, how are we going to make this work? Our life isn't going to change. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing and working however many hours a week. And the reality is that I think there's some kind of key learnings and ways that we've made it work over the years. I think one is, and I'm very open about this, is I outsource where I can and delegate where I can. And that means both that's at work and that's at home, right? I have an incredible team and invest a lot in my teams at work. And then they pay that back. And I'm like very fortunate to be surrounded by such amazing talent there. And then on the home side, my kids are a little bit older. We still have an afternoon nanny. I'm big on you outsource the things that you don't enjoy as much. I don't enjoy, for example, like cooking as much. So like we do meal delivery services, but there are certain things like, volunteering in my kids' classrooms is important to me. And, it's important to have the boundaries and be clear about what you do enjoy and want to make time and space for. So that's a big piece. And then my husband and I are like, there's a lot of conversations around coordination. So we meet every Sunday night. We talk about the calendars for the week. We have a shared family calendar. A lot of text messages back and forth of who's doing what and who's supposed to be where at any one point in time. And so there's a lot, and it doesn't, and it shifts and it changes, right? And who's leaning into their career and like trying to have those conversations with each other too, like, is it working? Is it not working? What else can we try? And continuing to iterate on that, just like on a product, right? Is like, we're also iterating on like how we can make this work as a family. So I think those are some of the kind of things of how do I make it work? But I'm also fortunate. I think the last thing I'll say is to work on products and businesses that I'm really passionate about. And I think that that's what makes it worth it for me at the end of the day, is that I am showing up to support my current role, to support our chief members in getting to that next level, in finding their personal board of directors, in not feeling like they're lonely at the top. And that's something that I'm personally very passionate about. And so that drives, and I found that for me, that's a really big, that just makes it all worth it, is to work on. And the Mom Project was similar, something that I really care about deeply, is something that makes everything else work or worthwhile, and it makes it easier to figure out how to make the things work kind of around the edges.
I just love that, on so many grounds. I think one thing that you talked about, outsourcing, getting help. And I know I've felt guilty a lot of the times, kind of outsourcing certain bits. So I also do meal delivery. I think I've been doing that for years now. I used to cook when my little one just started eating. And I think once he transitioned into adult food, that said, like, I'm like, no, it's, I think, more important to do X with the family. And so for that, the other thing has to go, right? And always talk about, you have to eliminate in order to get clarity, like just not about prioritizing, you have to deprioritize some of this stuff too from your life. And I don't think as women and moms, we should feel guilty about doing it.
No, exactly.
Yeah. And it is complicated and it's messy. I think that's
Oh,
something
yeah.
else that you talked about, with your calendar and who's where and text messages and things like that. And I think that's, again, it's part of life, and that's okay.
It is. And it was a learning, because I think I am historically was someone who was very organized and on top of things. And there was a certain amount of letting go of control that I think both, and this applies sure to working parents, but even more broadly, as you get more senior, you have more scope. There's just more going on, other caretaking responsibilities, right? It's not all about, we're kind of in this sandwich generation, older parents, right? Whatever it is, it is okay for it to be messy, and like you just kind of have had to come to terms with some of that chaos, which was not always easy, and is an ongoing journey. But I think has been important for me, also from a mental health perspective.
And I know, Sana, we didn't talk about it, but previously, so I'm just going to ask here, and I would love to see if you have anything that you wanted to share here. You said you've had to learn to be okay with the messy and the chaos. What were some of the things that helped you?
Yeah.
I think feel comfortable with it.
Great question. So many things. I feel like, just like at work, we have toolkits, also it's like I have my personal toolkit and or toolbox, right, of different tools to pull out. I think community is a big one, and normalizing even us having this conversation today. But also, I'm fortunate to have friends from previous roles. Even I look back at the Mom Project, the CTO and VP of product, Jess, who I think recommended like that we actually connect, like are just phenomenal sounding boards and friends who can relate kind of to where I'm coming from. And so having and not feeling alone in that, and being able to have those conversations and normalize it. I think that doing that both in a community setting, also whether it's coaching or even therapy, I am a big advocate of. And then even just more broadly, like, we all have kind of mental models, things from when we were younger that we come with, and doing that work, right? Like being able to do that work on yourself so that you can then show up to others, whether that be your family or whether that be your team, is important. And that can look different for different people, whether it's therapy, medication, like, going to the doctor, like it's okay. Like it's important to invest in that and invest in yourself and take care of yourself. It's kind of that, like, put your own oxygen mask on first so that you're then able to help others. And it took me time to get there. And I've tried a lot of those mindfulness and meditation. I've kind of fallen off my practice a little bit, but that was a big one, just kind of learning to accept what and be grounded in what is in the here and now, and then finding places to process. So a lot of where I do my processing is I like to walk. And people will even say that they see me wandering around the neighborhood. That is where I process and think, and how am I actually feeling, and just try to be kind of mindful in that moment.
Love it. Absolutely. I mean, these are such important things. And I think, the inner work is so important, because if that is not the exterior side, like it's not going to support and work. So let's jump in now to the meat and potatoes of our conversation today. So we're going to start with your journey, career journey, Saana. And so if you were to look back, what were some of the key moments that shaped your career, especially in senior executive roles? And what have you had to unlearn along the way?
Yeah, there are a couple that come to mind. One is a little bit earlier, actually, before I was in more of a leadership role, but was when I was first getting into product. So as you mentioned, I started my career coming out of college in consulting. For me, I knew I had actually pivoted during college from being pre-med into business, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I was like, okay, how do I kind of get a broad business foundation or biggest amount of learning? What does that look like? And that's how I ended up in consulting. And honestly, it was probably the level of rigor that I put into making that decision, and was a wonderful learning opportunity. Like, met amazing people, was pushed so hard, just the level of strategic thinking, stakeholder alignment, all kinds of things you learn there. But really, the reality was not loving my time and really was not enjoying it. And when I reflected on it, was for a few reasons, which I'm happy at, like in hindsight, I was able to identify, which is we would make these amazing recommendations, but we were so far away from the actual impact and the end user, that you never got to see the loop close and actually be able to then see what ended up happening and did it work and what was the impact on the user. And so for me then, while I still wasn't at that time, product wasn't as a well-known of a function or a field. And so I was trying to figure out, okay, I'm leaving consulting. What do I do next? And I was thinking, what's pretty far away from what this is? And so for me, having grown up mostly, my parents are from Finland originally, but I grew up mostly here in the Bay Area, and having seen the startup ecosystem. So I thought, okay, I'll join a startup. So I joined a startup, small Series B e-commerce startup with about 30 people, and because it was so small, in hindsight, it was a really wonderful opportunity where there were probably 3 or 4 of us who weren't like either engineers or on the customer support team. So to really do everything, I was doing product, data, strategy, marketing, like you name it. Like I probably couldn't even it was like, writing decks, working on fundraising. And in hindsight, that's where I first had my taste of product. I was like, this is what I want to be working on. This, like, solving problems for users. And I'm big on, it doesn't matter, don't care so much what whether it's a problem, like a user problem, job to be done, use case, but like, how do I like actually help someone do something in a way that is better, in a way that is like making a difference in their lives? And the harder the problem, the better. That was where I really kind of found product. So that was a pretty key moment, I would say, in my career, and not one necessarily that I could have kind of forecasted. I think maybe the learning there is that it's okay if there are things that don't feel like the right fit, even though it felt like I had this great consulting role and, in a prestigious company, but like that really was not a happy period in my life, and that's okay, right? And so kind of going back and trying to figure out what that is. And then I think something I kind of stumbled upon was this opportunity to test different things, right? Is like, how can you, it's almost like this hypothesis driven approach even to your career of like, how can you go out and like test some of these things out of what you want your next role to look like. So that was a big one. And then I think the second, maybe I'll start with maybe one more key moment, and we can talk about if we want to do the third one. The second one is probably going to Instagram. So I had then been kind of in the middle part of my career at a number of startups. I like the small team. I like the scrappiness. I like being able to kind of build from scratch. But I had reached this point in my career where I'd been doing so much learning on the job, right? Of like, because often you have a much smaller product team, right? You don't have as big of a bench of product leaders to be learning from or watching. And that's not to say I didn't have amazing, leaders, but just looking for kind of, what does best in class look like, right? Rather than like, how do we figure it out here and now in this small company? What does best in class product leadership actually look like? And that was what brought me to Meta and Facebook. And in some ways, actually, and I think that's an interesting thing too, I joined as an IC and felt almost like I was taking a bit of a step back. Meta is very flat. Was like, am I really going to take what feels like kind of a step back leveling wise? But for me, it was really solving for that learning and that growth, and took the risk for that reason. So I joined as an ICPM, working on growth for the Instagram app. So really thinking through for new users of Instagram, how do we help them actually understand what Instagram is? How do we help them create their account? How do we notify them of new things that are happening that we think would be interesting for them? And really kind of thinking about it, especially from a product angle, which I think sometimes people kind of have some questions around. And so joined as an ICPM and worked hard. I really was focused on doing a good job and kind of proving myself and working hard. And I think one learning there but was at a point where, often people are excited about getting to the next level. And the reality is that there's both you in terms of your performance, but also this question of business need, right? Often in these conversations of, okay, how do we think about, and you need to have both in order to be ready for a promotion. And in this case, I was excited for it, but needed to wait for the role to open up. The reality is that, once you start getting to certain levels, there's no certain number of the positions. You need somebody else to be moving on or moving out. And eventually, that did actually happen. but had been fortunate so that, was really there even before that had happened, was fortunate to learn from some fantastic leaders there that I think you just can't. I think that's another key learning that I would say is like finding people who are willing to invest in you. And even because sometimes people put pressure on finding mentors or sponsors, but like, how do you find the people that you can learn from, look up to, grow from? And in a place like a Meta, which is so much bigger, was just, yes, thank you for clarifying that acronym, was, in a place like Meta was amazing, like being able to learn from Bengali Kaba, who's then was at Instacart and now is leading a big product team at YouTube, or Max, who's now the co-head of product at Instacart, like just Caroline, like Gaffney, just fantastic leaders to watch and to learn from. And so then when this position opened up, it was like, okay, I felt, I felt ready. That's maybe a little bit of a lie. Excited, and also like, oh, okay, is this actually really happening? So then moved into kind of the next step up, which was a team lead role. And eventually a similar thing happened again, where, then Brett Kynes, who was at the time the head of growth, kind of moved on. And so now the position opened up. And I think the big learning there is, yes, it's important to advocate for yourself, but also it's important to have done the work behind the scenes, to have built the relationships, to have proven yourself so that you are top of mind for people when these roles do open up, right? Because some of that is also outside of your control.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I can talk about others, but I think the maybe the third transition point is going back to kind of more passion-driven work, and eventually leaving Instagram.
Got it. I mean, these are really, really important, because I know that there is so much of conversation about moving up and getting promoted, because we all want that career growth and that trajectory to move. But I think a lot of times it's like advocate for yourself. But a lot of the times you have to really be mindful of the timing. And I'm not saying, this is like a lot of the conversations I have when I'm coaching PMs and product leaders. And I'm like, it could be that, yes, you do need to do a little bit of work in advocating for yourself, but there are some must-haves, that ingredients that need to happen. And that is, you have to have that credibility and sustainable credibility. It's not just like one project that has gone really awesome and that's why the promotion needs to happen. You do need to advocate, but sometimes it's also about the timing, right? Is there a fit between where the company is and what the business needs are and what you're trying to do? And, you can wait if that works for you, but sometimes if it's not, then you got to start looking at other options. It's so much like the hypothesis-driven approach that you've kind of talked about. So love this. I know you talked about hard work, and I just had this, I was just thinking about this because something came up on Instagram, I think a few weeks ago, where some people were talking about, you have to not work hard, but work smart. And I started thinking about like, okay, so is hard work overrated? Like, are we now sending the message that we don't need to work hard? You need to find hacks and loopholes in the system to get what you want in life and in career. So what are your thoughts? And again, I know we didn't prepare for this question, so it was just interesting that it just popped up.
Yeah, that is, I definitely have thoughts. So I think largely I agree with you. So I think what I would say is that for me at least, and I think it depends. I think it's also important for people to like recognize for themselves and at different phases of their lives what are their boundaries? What is their kind of personality? For me, hard work and resilience and grit is a lot of where I've gotten. Like, I don't want to pretend it's not true. Like, a lot of where I've gotten. My parents were immigrants. A lot of where I've gotten in life, I'm like, I think I can work harder than the next person. And that is like, and it's not always enough, but you know what? It actually makes a difference. Now, that being said, what I will say is, and a mistake that I definitely see people make is, it's not just hours for the sake of hours, but it is focusing on the actual outcomes that you're trying to drive, right? And so being clear about, okay, what are you actually working towards and why are you working so hard? And ideally tying that back to the business impact and the user impact that you're driving. That is like very key in my mind of prioritizing that time spent. Like, time is our most precious resource, right? It's like, how do you ruthlessly prioritize that, your time, right? And I feel very strongly for my teams of like, and you can work hard, but you can also work flexibly. And I think this is really important, especially for working parents. And it's true for how I live my life. Like, got a lot of stuff to do, but you know what? If I need to go take a meeting at the school, I will be at that meeting at the school, and then I'll make it up later, right? And I really believe in that for my go do the daycare pickup, go do whatever it is that you like. Could care less if you can't be, doing it at right now at 12 o'clock, as long as you get your work done and you're driving towards the outcomes and the KPIs that are going to make the biggest difference. You can do it wherever you want, whenever you want. That is kind of my philosophy.
Love. Awesome. Let's move into a little bit of a different topic. I'm seeing a lot of questions that have come up on that, and that's on leadership styles. So leading teams in general today, they look very different from what it used to even 3-5 years ago, right? Lots of stuff has changed. And so I'd love to hear from you, Saana, like, what do you think? What do you see? Things like big change, right? Like even 1 or 2 things. And what does leading well look like today as a leader? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think things have changed, right? I think we we could safely say that we're all probably trying to do more with less is with the current macroeconomic environment. And I think it does come a little bit back to actually what I was just talking about with where when you're tight on resources. And in this case, one of the resources can be team, right? Resources are also time in a lot of ways. That is capacity, right? Like time times the number of people, right? And so what I come back to is a couple things. One is that ruthless prioritization now of your team more broadly. And how do you make sure that your team is working on the things that are the most important? And I really go back to a place, like a more tactical example that I see on the product side sometimes is something that would be really, and it sounds obvious and it's not, like really cool to build, or one user reported this bug and it's like, yeah, that would be nice to fix, but how do we make sure that we are focusing on the things that are going to impact the most users and make the biggest difference, that are tied to the mission that we are here to solve, right? And that like ladder up. I'm very big on ideally each product team having one key success KPI, right? So it's very clear what they're focusing on, and that should ladder clearly into the company success metrics. And I think it's even more important at a time when you're really kind of feeling the crunch to be very clear about where that line is and what's most important. And then I think the next part of that then is the visibility and communication pieces, where what I see with product leaders as they get more senior, and I had a mentor tell me once that product leaders should be spending at least 30% of their time on communication. And I was very, very struck by that. I was like, that's a lot of time doing something that feels like, it's like, what is the actual, it doesn't feel as tangible, right? But the reality is that as a product leader, it is your job to be giving as much of that kind of context to your teams, and setting that strategy and that tone. And that takes time, right? That takes time. Like, may have to say that in many different places, in many different channels. And then the vice versa, right, is when you're, really ruthlessly prioritizing, you have your shortlist. How do you make sure that your cross-functional partners, how do you make sure your leadership team is aware of that? And same thing, you probably need to, I come back to, like, it's on you to make sure that they've heard it. If they haven't heard it, you haven't communicated it effectively yet. So it's like, what are all of the different places, channels you can do that, and just continuing to repeat that over and over and over again so that people are clear on that.
This is just top notch. I loved some of these tangible examples that you shared, Saana. I think, a lot of the times, like, I think it was just last week, I was actually helping out a senior product leader, and it became pretty clear that this particular person was here. They're going through lots of stuff in their company, just like many companies right now. And what was happening was that the individual product teams were just kind of getting everything that was being thrown at her, and she was basically handing it off. And it was really important, I think, for her to realize that her role is not just being a messenger, but she also has to filter stuff. And it is her job to then set expectations with her peers and folks higher up to kind of say, okay, this doesn't. So I think it's so important, like you're talking about the communication, because it does take that time. If you're supposed to remove all of those political barriers for your team so that they can focus and they can deliver those outcomes, then your job changes as you climb up. You're not just a product manager, right? Like, it's so interesting. I wanted to kind of, I think, move, stay within the realm of leadership, but kind of really talk about, we talked about leaders. Let's talk about product managers. What do they need to know right now in the changing landscape?
Yeah. I think a couple things. I think there is some commonality, right? Like maybe there's a little bit less of like time spent on a day-to-day basis on communication, although I would argue that communication is still one of the like key skill sets for even an individual contributor as a PM. But I go back to the prioritization question of like, for your product area, what are the biggest opportunities? Like, what are you seeing from a data perspective that are the biggest gaps? And then how do you leverage research insights to answer like why you think that that's happening? And then you go back to the, okay, how am I suggesting actual features or solutions to those problems that I'm seeing, and framing those things? And I say that again because I think it's important to ground ourselves in that understanding and the why of what you're saying. Something is important, but why is that the most important thing to work on? Why do you think that will be so valuable to your user? Why is that a problem for the user? Why is that the key job to be done? So I think, and I think that there's a lot of verbal communication. I actually find that like writing, and I'm someone who's big on I care a lot less about the like aesthetics of the presentation, but actually write it, whether it's a spec or a PRD or in a doc, of like, okay, what is that? Like, what is your strategy for your area? What is the current landscape from a data and a research perspective? And what are the biggest opportunities? And what are you recommending that you should go do about it? I think those are some, and then I think it needs to ladder into that key North Star of like, what is that most important KPI for your team? I think that's another thing I see. There's so many things any team could be doing at any one point in time. And one thing I say to my teams is like, it feels really hard to say no, but it's like, not yet. Like we can get to it at some point. We have these 6 metrics that we want to move. I love it. But like, let's focus on the first one first. And then we can come to numbers 2 through 6, next year or next quarter or whenever it is.
I love the not yet. It's been, I think, one of my favorite things too, because I know early on in my career, I was so gung-ho because everybody said, you have to say no, you have to say no. I would actually walk into conversations reminding myself I need to say no, because I know that there's going to be an ask from someone from sales and I just can't do it. I got to protect my team and I got to protect the backlog and I got to protect this. But it really didn't serve me because I wasn't even ready to hear what they were saying. And because my whole agenda and my whole purpose to go to a particular conversation was to shut it down. But I had to actually retrain myself to say, okay, it's not yet, right? Let's kind of hear it out and let's see what is it. Does it even make sense to bump? Because maybe I'm missing some of the context there, and asking. It's not so much even asking these questions, it's even asking yourself so that you can get some of these insights and then have that conversation. So love this. Saana, I want to go ahead.
Yeah, totally, completely agree. Like coming from that, I think that's been a big learning for me of coming from that place of curiosity, right? Of how do I understand where you're coming from? And sometimes the ask is even different. There are different solutions, right? Maybe and just by hearing out that person, you might think of something that doesn't even require time on your roadmap. That is like, oh, let me just help you with something in Excel, or like connect you with another person. Then you can find what I call those like win-win situations, right? Of like, okay, it actually didn't need to take space on the roadmap, but I was able to help a partner and strengthen that trust and credibility, and put myself in the mindset of like, what is right for the business, right? It's like, it's not just what is right for my team, but if I put myself in the shoes of the CEO, how do I balance these two things?
Absolutely. I want to move into the Instagram story. I know I've read somewhere that you helped the platform grow into 1 billion monthly active users. And so what I really want to ask here is, can you share a little bit about the messy bits that helped you achieve this huge milestone at Instagram? What were some of those things? What did you do? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, good question. And I'm here, and the reason I'm pausing, I'm like, because normally, when you're used to, in many environments, like, okay, how do you tell the positive version of the story in an interview, right? It's like, okay, this is what we did, this is how we got there. So I'm like, all right, let me think about all the things that went, which is, I mean, of course, there were many things that went wrong, but I think where I would start from. So when I joined Instagram in 2017, the reality was that we were already pretty focused on late adopters here in the US. So like most people understood Instagram really, like, if we thought about users under 40, everybody had it. Which was very different then, though, from other markets where you had, especially one of our big focus areas was Southeast Asia, where you had actually like a lot of earlier adopters. And so it's very interesting to be serving two very, very kind of different user segments or personas. But I think some of my biggest learnings and some interesting things, and I'll talk about some messy bits, is in general how important it was to remove friction. Because at the end of the day, right, like they were, especially the early adopters, they're trying to figure out this paradigm and this mental model of how Instagram works. And that feels so obvious, right, to users who have been doing it for a long time, but it's not that obvious, right? And so even small changes at that scale can make a huge difference. So whether you're making a flow more intuitive, whether you're explaining why you're asking for certain information, whether you're helping people get into their accounts, when you have 1 million people a day who are like going through your sign up and your onboarding flows, even small changes can make a huge difference. And it's important to approach that from a hypothesis driven perspective. But at Instagram and Facebook, like, a lot of people might have heard is very data driven. And it's definitely, like, I found that to be very true, where we would A/B test anything and everything before we were going to ship it. And understand what those success, what was that driving from an impact perspective in terms of monthly active users. So were more people actually able to get into their accounts? Were they understanding and deciding to retain on Instagram? And even to the point where I was gold in my performance reviews on like how many incremental monthly active users did my teams bring to the Instagram platform, and we were able to measure that. In terms of some of the messiness, though, I think, even kind of near the end of my time at Instagram, we were having a lot more conversations around the role of Instagram in the family of apps, right? Like now Facebook has been renamed Meta. And so what is the role of Instagram versus a Facebook versus a WhatsApp versus a Messenger? And how do you communicate that clearly to users without detracting away from the job that they're there to do, right? Because a lot of this is like, a lot of the growth principles are like, the more distracting you are, the more confusing it is, the more that takes away from the core reason that the user came, which was to most likely scroll their feed or potentially to post content. And so that was super interesting, and to be part of some of those conversations. I think messiness is like, it's hot when you've got teams then who have competing, you've got we had Facebook growth teams and a WhatsApp growth team. And, it's like, should these be centralized teams? Should these be independent teams? How do we work together? Who gets to make the decisions? Even on the Instagram side of, okay, we wanted to make it more clear that Instagram was actually owned by Facebook and Meta. How do you communicate? Like, is that beneficial to a user? Where should we do that? Like, there are a lot of, even from a placement perspective, as you think about a rebrand, like splash screens, and should we put it at the top of the feed? And how do we frame something like that? So that was definitely, there was definitely some real messiness there from a framing perspective, from a strategic perspective, also from stakeholder, like, I was not in the meetings with Mark, but he had a lot of views, right? And like CEOs are allowed to have a lot of views. And so there was definitely some very real messiness there. And then I think the last piece I'll say that I learned from my time there, messiness too with very interesting, kind of the perception. It was kind of the early start of some of the regulatory scrutiny, and some of the PR and media framing was interesting, because I actually think, even now looking from the outside in, there are absolutely opportunities for Instagram and Facebook to be doing certain things differently. And it was incredible how many of sometimes those articles and reports were just factually not true. And I knew, you knew that. I'm like, I know there's a team that, like, I know the people on the team that are working on this. This is not true, that this is not something that we are not thinking about. And that was just interesting more broadly as a business leader, of just a reminder sometimes of what press and media is trying to drive towards, which is they want, engagement and clicks at the end of the day. And most likely when you're getting positive press, it's probably overblown positive. And when you're getting negative press, it's overblown negative. So less kind of specific to product, but definitely an interesting observation when I was there.
Thank you, Saana. I'm going to take one audience question here, and that is, if you are an individual contributor PM, how do you demonstrate leadership within your role without taking formal team leadership responsibilities?
Yeah, it's a great question, because PM is a very interesting role in that way, right? Where you have a team, you may have, if you're in a bigger company, like many cross-functional partners of design, eng, data, content design, research, and they don't report to you, right? But you are still the kind of de facto leader of that team. I do think that, I think a couple things for me. I think one, I think for each person, I think it's important to stay authentic to your style. So I think that, like, I have some thoughts on like how I do it, but I think it's important also, like, and this is like leadership more broadly, that, like, you're kind of authentic to yourself. But I think that some ways, I think I would probably come back to communication in that case, of like showcasing that leadership of, I think you can bring together team meetings and be communicating with your cross-functional partners, arming them with information, helping set the kind of roadmap, not just from an engineering perspective, but also from your, like, what are you understanding from a data and a research perspective? And then I think communicating that upward. And I think, again, in this case, communication being communication is really an art in many ways, where in that case, how do you make it as digestible as possible for your leadership? Where think about even tactical things like bullets rather than big, long paragraphs, the shorter, the better. How do you put it in the body of the email rather than in attachments, right? Like, what do you put in an email versus a Slack, right? But being really, there's so much information in today's age for all of us to consume. And so how do you make that as digestible as possible so you get your key points across? And then I think the other place is, like, they're always, as leaders, like, they're all, even for everyone, there's more to do than we have people to do. And so how do you raise your hand? I think often like I've done it in the past, like for leading ERGs or doing, and it gives you exposure also, or projects that nobody else wants to take on can sometimes be one where you then get exposure to leadership that you maybe wouldn't have otherwise, when it's kind of the, like, there's one I did at Instagram around GDPR implementation, right? Like, not a super, like, I think most people would be like, I'm sure there are people who are very passionate about it, and I love that for them. But I think for most people, probably not the project where they're like, yes, please pick me. But the reality was that it had very real, both legal and policy risk, but also growth implications. And so it created some real opportunities for exposure also then to presenting to senior leadership, because they had to care and make sure that it was going well. So I think those are a couple of the things that I would think about.
Awesome. Saana, I know we chatted so much about all these amazing things that you've done. If you were to look back, would you do anything differently? Are there any regrets?
I don't think so. I don't know. And I don't know. I'm big on reflection and learning, I think, and that's something that really drives me, is kind of learning and growth, if that hasn't come through. But I also think that, I guess I'm someone who thinks, A, that things kind of happen for a reason, and B, also that and I was reinforced to me actually recently. I started re-listening to a book called Designing Your Life. And I think there's probably multiple right paths for all of us. And so I try to remind myself of that, of like, there's no one perfect right decision. There are multiple good decisions. And so, because sometimes for me, like I find myself in that analysis paralysis of like, is this the right thing to be, doing? And it's like, there are probably multiple right things to be doing, right? And so you pick the most right one that feels right at the time, and then you can iterate, you can change, right? As like so a couple of things I think about there is like, I think it's Jeff Bezos's framework around one-way versus two-way doors, right? Is like, is this a one-way door or a two-way door? And really push yourself, as in like, can you walk this decision back if you change your mind? And most decisions, it might be messy. You can change your mind in the future. And then I think the other thing that I would I don't know if I would change, but actually this is one I would change, is I think at the beginning of my career, I was very set on like 10-year, 15-year career plans. And then I was working backwards from that. Like, if I want to get there, it makes sense, right? How do I work backward from that? And I think something that I found is that you can also spend a lot of time doing that, and the world changes and you change. And for me these days, I am much more likely to pick my next role or my next opportunity based on the learning and growth opportunity. And does it feel right? Right? Is that the team that feels right and a product that I want to work on? And I think that has served me a lot. I think that served me well, rather than feeling earlier in my career like there are certain steps that I should, in order to get to this role, I have to suck it up and do this role or do this job. It's like, you know what? Life is short. I'm going to work on the things that I am excited and passionate about, just like I hope I can bring that to my teams, right? And that has, in these last couple, career shifts, has seemed to serve me. Actually, I think that's been a learning, has served me just fine. I've still been progressing in my career, even without that, like, okay, if I do this, then what comes next? So I'm kind of taking it more one day, 1 year, one role at a time.
Wonderful. And I think this connects with something that you had shared with me, and that is, I think as women, a lot of times we confuse, maybe this is true for men too, but want versus should. As we're thinking about career, can you maybe talk a little bit about that for our listeners?
Totally. Yeah. This was something I worked on, just with full disclosure, a fair bit in therapy with my therapist, and was a real unlock for me, because I do think that, so even I think one example of where I was kind of stuck in this was actually when I was in the interim head of growth role at Instagram, and I had the opportunity to interview to be in that role full time, right? And to be the head of growth for Instagram. I was like, on paper, of course I should want this. Like, who wouldn't want this role? Of like everything I worked for in my career, like this is exactly what I should be doing and what I should be wanting. But then doing some soul searching, be like, but is it actually what I want? Like, does it actually feel right? And for various reasons, in that case, that wasn't the case. And I painted but this was like months and months of reflection. And that's something I've taken away since then, is something where I have a tendency to get back and I should want to do this. It's like, no, but do you actually want to do it? Or is this something that you feel like you should do? Has really been a big, something that is kind of something I'm reminding myself of as I live my life.
That's really interesting. Do you struggle when you have to make the trade-off between want versus should, especially for something that maybe seems like a no-brainer? Like, why should I not take the head of growth? I mean, on paper and everything else, I mean, kind of like seems like that's the right path. Like, how do you make peace with some of these trade-offs?
Yeah, 100% I struggle with it. I think that some of the struggle is every decision you make has trade-offs, right? And so I think often in those, and I'm trying to lay out what some of those trade-offs are. And I think that for me, these days, those trade-offs often end up being either kind of, for me personally and my own kind of well-being and mental health, either because of the level of stress, because of the type of work that is required from a day-to-day perspective, and how that fits with kind of where I see my strengths or where I like to spend my time. Or there's a very real trade-off with my family, right? And whether it's travel or whether it's, flexibility to be able to go to some of those school events and spend time with my kids in the evenings, let's say. And so yes, I struggle with it. And I think I struggle with it as someone who probably has taken a lot of value in their life out of their like career achievements, and trying to remember that like that's not necessarily what brings, it isn't like, it was, you can even hear me now necessarily, I know it's not what brings me happiness at the end of the day. It is those like smaller moments, and it is those moments to be able to have with my kids. I do want to have that impact at work, but it just isn't enough for that. Like, I don't want that to be everything and the only thing that I'm doing. And so but it does require me to go through that thought exercise of like, what are those trade-offs, and how do I think about balancing them? And then I try to remind myself that every time I've done that, I have been very at peace with it afterward. Even though it's very painful in the moment, I've never gone back and looked at it and been like, oh, I feel like I made the wrong decision. And then if I did, I could probably go back and, sure, that role wouldn't be open, but I could, go back and explore another similar role, or try to get into, find a similar role somewhere else.
And this is really powerful, because I think there are three big themes that came up as you were sharing that with me, Sana. One, I think, is to look at it from an abundance mindset and not a scarcity mindset, because I think a lot of the times, I think this is very true for women, because there are fewer roles, there are fewer opportunities where, I mean, let's just face it, that's the fact for women. That I think sometimes we do get that pressure. We feel that pressure, like, if I can't do this, then it might never even come. And so I think really kind of thinking like, no, there will be other roles, right? Like, even in this market, it might not be the best, but there are companies and future companies, like, it'll happen. And I think the other thing that you were talking about is, I think, really thinking about what are some of your non-negotiables that you're not going to negotiate no matter what, right? And that's where, you have to make sure that your cup is full, you're at peace as you're making these trade-off decisions. And yes, it's going to be hard, it's going to be messy, you're going to question yourself, but you will be at peace. And I think that's what matters. And then the third thing that I caught in all of this was, most decisions are reversible in life.
Mm-hmm.
It's right. So perfect. I'm going to go into a little bit that you were talking about, just being a parent and being in a very high profile role, very successful leader and an executive right now. What are some of the unglamorous and maybe non-Instagram worthy real bits, of what is really going on? Like, do you anything that you can kind of share? Because I know that there are a lot of women, I can see a lot of women who have joined us today, that would kind of make them kind of feel like, okay, you know what, I'm okay. Anything that you want to share from that?
Yeah. Let's see, there's many unglamorous bits. I think, I think just continuing to find the balance, right, is like, we talked about outsourcing, the importance of outsourcing things you don't enjoy, and with the recognition of like that you can afford, and trying to remember, because like there's the reality that outsourcing also costs money, and then trying to frame that in the lens of what is my like actual future earnings potential. So it may feel like a lot of money today, but what does that unlock from a compounding perspective, right? When I think about my future earnings. And even so, like trying to, I still was like running around doing laundry this morning and looking for the folder for the reading, and spend a lot of time still doing the dishwasher. Like, it's not like that's just like those things, they happen, like somebody's got to do them. And, continuing to reflect on like, okay, you probably need to make some more shifts, and try to think about kind of where it makes sense for me to be spending my time. I think, my kids will always ground me. Like, that is on, it's like, there's when you spend time with your kid, they want you are not a lead. Well, actually, hopefully you're like a parent leader to them, but they want you to be wiping their bottom and, like whatever it is that they need at that point in time. And other unglamorous parts of the job. Multitasking, there's a lot of I have probably slacked people from I think that is just like a parenting hack of like, as I'm walking to school, when I'm dropping someone off, when I'm running an errand or be on a call, like with video, it's a little harder with all the video calls, but like you can slack from a lot of different places in the world. And I'm okay, like everyone needs to make their decisions. I'm very okay. Like to me, that is, for some of the more tactical back and forth is time well spent. I think those are, I don't know if you had something else in mind, but those are some of the examples that come to mind.
These are all wonderful. And I think for anyone who is listening to this, I think, you do you, right? What works and what I think you can live by, and you're not going to like, it's going to just work for you and your family, right? I think that is really the key. And, don't chase perfection. Like I think for me, I was very much in like everything needs to be at the right place, and it would just irk me if things were like off the place, and that was probably my OCD. Just home setting wise, like the coffee table has to be spanking clean, everything. Then as I had Tanish, and he went into his stage where there were Lego blocks everywhere.
Oh yeah.
I had to change my definition of what clean looks like. What my working table.
I'll show you something, which actually was right behind me, but I did move. I was like, I've got Magnetile creations that I'm keeping safe right here on my desk next to me.
Oh yes, and you cannot destroy it, because I had the same Magnetile creation that my son decided it needs to be something. He made it for me. It's my birthday coming up next week, and he put it on top of my laptop. And he said, "Mom, please don't move it." And I'm like, well, that doesn't work. Like, can I put it on the side? And he's like, "No, I want you to see it." And I'm like, okay. So I've had to put it on the side. And when he comes back in the evening, I'm going to put it back on my, it's not lying, but it is making do with, so yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. So
I have to ask, what day is your birthday, Bosky?
It's Tuesday.
Mine too. We share a birthday.
Oh, how cool is that? How cool is that?
Yeah.
Well, happy birthday in advance.
Happy early birthday to you.
Awesome. Well, that is such a coincidence. Love it. I wanted to talk a little bit about performance reviews before we end today's conversation, very briefly, because I know that is in mind of a lot of people as they're coming up for the end of the year in a few months. And so what is one piece of advice you would like to give to people managers?
Yeah. This one may feel obvious, but I'm amazed at how often and frequently I still see it happening, which is that feedback should never be a surprise. Performance management is something that happens and as is feedback, on a continuous basis, right? And should never be a surprise as you're delivering it in that performance review. And so even if it's hard for many people to do, so normalizing that, but also needs to be something that you hold yourself accountable to. So I've found different things in the past of like scheduling even a bi-monthly, bi-directional feedback session where you have to make the time and space for it if you're struggling to do it, or writing down constructive feedback to hold yourself accountable to actually delivering it. And then I think the last thing for people leaders, I'd say, that I've kind of learned is really taking the time to prepare for calibrations, right? So you can advocate for your team and being clear on what that business impact is that they drove, so you can really have a strong case for any promotions. That's something that is much harder to do. Sounds obvious on the fly, but like really taking that time and thinking about what objections other people might have. Sometimes another strategy is like you kind of start to foreshadow it in a previous review cycle so that like you're starting to build buy-in ahead of time for some of those. And then not being afraid to manage people out. It's hard, and you just need to think about not just yourself and that person, but how that impacts the rest of the team, because people who either don't want to be there or who are and of course, first you try to coach them up, right? But if it gets to the point where it's not working, it impacts everyone around them. So and obviously working together with your HR people team to do that. I think that's some of the, I'm trying to think. I think that's some of the big ones.
Awesome. Well, this was wonderful, Saana. Is there anything that you want to share especially for maybe some of the early career women in tech or mid-career women in tech? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say find the opportunities to try different things. I think that's big. And talk to different people. Remember that like networking and mentorship is not always just the people. Ask for it. And I'm sure many people, you'll be surprised, will be happy to chat with you. But also a lot of my network and the learning is also from women and colleagues, right, that I worked with who are at the same level as me, right? So just really thinking about like building those relationships of who you know, and who's in your network early on, because that just, continues to grow over time. And being authentic to yourself. I think we all have a different, and that's okay. And being okay with that, right? And accepting yourself and figuring out what that authentic leadership looks like to you. I think those are the big things.
Thank you so much, Saana. This was really, really wonderful chatting with you. And again, thank you everyone for joining in. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share it with friends. You'll have the recording out here. Please share it, help spread the word. And feel free to follow me and Saana on LinkedIn for more tidbits on women in leadership, in tech, and some of those real conversations that really should be happening, but oftentimes doesn't happen. And bye now, and have an amazing rest of the day. And hope you enjoyed today's episode. See ya.
Thank you so much, Baski. Bye, everybody.
Saana.